Warning: this video will completely spoil Final Fantasy VII Remake, and the original. However, major spoilers for the original Final Fantasy VII Beyond Midgar will be relegated to a specific section that you can skip using timestamps in the description. Well, it's here. It's finally here. I don't think I'll ever again be as excited for any other piece of entertainment as I was when I turned on the first part of Final Fantasy VII Remake. This is a game I'd been hoping for as far back as the mid-2000s, when I learned that Square was planning to remake Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9 for the PS2. The original Final Fantasy VII is tied with 8 and 9 as my favorite game of all time, and I don't expect that will ever change. They're definitely not the best games, but their impact on me personally is massive. Final Fantasy VII Remake could never have done the same thing for me, and it would be unfair to expect it to. I'm no longer a wide-eyed youth in a world where massive RPGs and comprehensive cinematic storytelling are a fresh experience in the mainstream gaming landscape. They're old hat by this point. I'm too experienced to be blown away by the poignancy of a game like Final Fantasy VII Remake, and yet when the game finally finished installing, there was a single moment where I was that kid again, anxious to play through what felt like an endless landscape of possibilities. There are really two ways I can discuss this game, each with their own value. But neither should be overvalued. If we get too caught up in what this game means as a remake of the original Final Fantasy VII, we lose sight of the fact that this isn't the original game, nor is it intended to be that, or a replacement for it. Every change suddenly becomes a mine that blows up in our faces when we tread on it, rather than something to be explored on its own merits. But if we get too caught up in what this game means as a game of its own, we forget that it's also intending, to some extent, to follow in the footsteps of a work that provided the world enough value to deserve being remade in the first place. Critique of this game needs to be flexible enough to judge deviations from the original both as changes and as fresh ideas. How they relate to the rest of this game in isolation is just as important as how they relate to the original. Arguably more important, considering flaws in the original should generally be rectified, not held onto like treasure. So with that in mind, I've decided to separate this video into two sections. One section will specifically discuss Final Fantasy VII Remake as a remake, the other will explore the game as its own thing, with its own value. When talking about this game as a remake, there's an important rule that I think is integral to being fair in our critique. What matters most is not whether the changes in remakes serve the original game more. What matters is whether or not the changes serve the remake more than if you would have kept it the same as the original. If the way the original did it would align better with the remake's goals more than the change they made, then you have a problem. But the problem isn't, this is less like the original, so it's worse. It's that they traded out for something that doesn't meld as well with their new goals. It's difficult to separate your knowledge of the original product from the way the remake is trying to do things. But it's also an important step if you're trying to meet said remake at its own goals. Change is okay as long as it has a purpose, and syncs with the focus of the rest of the work. We shouldn't inherently condemn risks just because they're different. And Remake needed a lot of changes, not just because there were flaws in the original that could be rectified, nor just because modern design expectations are vastly different from what they were at the dawn of 3D, but also because any form of AAA quality expansion on Final Fantasy VII from an artistic and design perspective requires an exponentially higher amount of work than what was needed in the original game. The fact is, the density of detail one would need to simply modernize Final Fantasy VII without adding any extra content is insane. Development tools have gotten far more efficient, for sure, but the amount of granular work that goes into design of a modern AAA game is astronomical today. People often compare Final Fantasy VII Remake to things like Persona 5 or Dragon Quest XI, while trying to argue Square could easily create the whole Final Fantasy VII Remake in a single part. But comparatively, these games are incredibly lean in detail and the nuances of their world design, animation, etc. Particularly because this is a truly 3D game that no longer compartmentalizes combat and exploration separately like the original, there's a significantly greater amount of work involved in realizing spaces from the original game. You have to make sure it's full of spaces that accommodate 3D camera control, for example. In the original, the only visuals that mattered were the parts of the scene that would be turned into a background bitmap. Sector 7 didn't have to be a whole slum, just a fairly basic and small impression of one. But in Remake, that's not the case. This not only means every direction you can point the camera has to be filled out with details, and significantly higher amounts of details than before, but it also affects scale. The illusion of this being a real place shatters if the scale is kept anywhere close to the same as it was in the original. The original could get away with areas that were often tiny, because there seemed to be a strong implication that what you see isn't all that's there. Sector 7 isn't just the bit surrounding the bar that we see. If you could turn around, there'd be more of it. But Remake has to prove that to us. It cannot imply it. In Remake, the scale of these areas has to be fully realized, or it will start to feel more like a cramped toy playhouse than a genuine environment. You also have to accommodate for the change in combat and general movement. Final Fantasy VII used different modes of play for exploration, the world map, and combat. All of these require different types of assets with a different workflow, but that also means you could scale things differently for each and the world would still feel cohesive. The original world in Final Fantasy VII was heavily abstracted. But when combat and exploration happen on the same level, in the same world, the same plane, both have to be taken into account when designing these areas. This is something Kingdom Hearts 1 got wrong, for example, with its platforming-centric level design often really hurting the combat with its use of cramped spaces. Your weapons constantly bonked off surfaces through no fault of your own, and the camera had a heart attack whenever you moved it. Contrast that with Kingdom Hearts 2, which, while it de-emphasized platforming a great amount, focused on ensuring every room where a fight could occur was a room designed with the full breadth of combat in mind. This is the sort of thing Final Fantasy VII Remake has to keep in mind as well. In this part of Remake in particular, both of these changes must have been rather difficult to work around, considering the slums make up a large portion of the places you explore. These are places that need to feel awkward, cramped, and restrictive, because they're made of junk that has fallen from above. But at the same time, they also need to be open, complex, and diverse enough to support combat, exploration, and our suspension of disbelief. For a moment, think about how this will affect later areas in Final Fantasy VII Remake. You have a world map in the original filled with unique areas like Costa del Sol, Nibelheim, Calm, the Gold Saucer, and much more. These too have exponentially more complex requirements if they're to be fully realized, and they each require using drastically different asset pools on top of that. You can't use Costa del Sol buildings to make Nibelheim, right? Without severely pulling back on the detail of areas like this, recreating them would have always inevitably required breaking the game into parts. Just the first part of Final Fantasy VII Remake, with as few CG cutscenes as it has, is 85 gigabytes. Beyond that, though, there's little sense in creating such dense, detailed, and complex asset pools if the player's going to pass by them in 2 minutes and never see them again. The developers need to be practical with their time and budget, so the time you spend in these places justifies the detail they put into them. Imagine if we did indeed just get through Midgar in the 5 to 8 hours of the original. Even if we cut out all of the assets related to areas that are new to the remake, that's an enormous enormous amount of work for it to only be used for a few hours. You can easily see where the level of detail they're using in Remake would break down if they went too narrow or too broad with their goals, by comparing it to Final Fantasy XV's world. That world was realistically an empty wasteland that only had like 3 major biomes, a small handful of towns, and then a bunch of rather generic, repeated assets that surround the few world set pieces. And most of those world set pieces have limited use, because they're so bespoke. What would be the point in the game forcing you to return to the place where you faced Titan a bunch of times? Once the game finally starts throwing more variety at you in quick succession, it has to close down into a linear sort of design like Final Fantasy XIII did, or the main story missions in Final Fantasy VII Remake. I genuinely can't think of a single JRPG by anyone else these days that has the same artistic fidelity, complexity, polish, and detail as a game like Final Fantasy VII Remake. That's not to say these other games look bad, play bad, or don't fit their own goals, but in the last decade-ish, the only JRPG I can think of that compared in detail density was Lost Odyssey. And that makes sense when you realize it was given tons and tons of Microsoft money and backing, specifically so that it could compete with the aesthetics and cinematography and detail density of Final Fantasy, which was still PlayStation exclusive at the time. None of Square's other JRPG projects really get the same scale of artistic effort either. Dragon Quest XI looks great, but it's kind of just a prettied up HD Dragon Quest VIII. It looks like a cartoon, relies heavily on canned animations, and lots and lots and lots of standard fields of green with beautiful but simple textures and repeated assets to explore. It's not bad by any means, nor is it wrong to even prefer the stylistic decisions in Dragon Quest XI. Not at all. But there's no denying that the artistic workload between the two design philosophies is night and day, and none of this even begins to get into the release schedule a remake that has to expand like this would need to keep in mind. Without the 1,000+ people working on their games like Rockstar has, there's really no way Square could have made such a detailed remake of the entirety of Final Fantasy VII, and still ended up with a product that looked and felt cutting edge by release. The longer it takes, the more assets and systems need to be rebuilt as time goes on to fit the current zeitgeist of graphics and presentation. Context is important for looking at the different scale of project these types of games entail. People often look at the big picture of graphics, animation, and general art without reflecting on how time-consuming it really is to make. I encourage everyone to start a new file in Remake and just walk around that first reactor. Reflect on the work that goes into everything. Is there a light fixture somewhere nearby? That light has to be designed by an artist to fit the environment. Then it has to be modeled. Then the model has to be authored for different levels of detail for the sake of maintaining performance. It has to have all of the appropriate texture layers applied to the mesh, it needs to be placed, and then an actual point light has to be positioned on it with proper color, intensity, etc. If it's not a completely real-time light, the effect of the light then needs to be baked into the surrounding textures. Get it slightly wrong, bake it again. A single light fixture. And that says nothing about the work that goes into making sure that light is useful as scene lighting and environment lighting, rather than just set dressing. Imagine that light is next to a steam effect coming out of a grate next to a valve, with wires emitting sparks nearby, and some coiled hose on the ground, the end of which is drooping over a small curb and animating slightly as to simulate the rumbling of nearby machinery. There's a single misplaced metal floor tile underneath the hose, a wrench nearby, and a grimy set of rust and dirt decals on the floor tile, as well as bump mapping or even parallax occlusion mapping, giving the textures a bit more of a 3D look. That stuff doesn't just materialize out of thin air, and even after it's made, it all has to be made to look great, serve game design purposes, preferably be reusable, and not break the performance budget in the process. It's a constant process of push, pull, give, take, and one has to hope that each division is in proper communication with each other, or lots of time can end up being wasted. Art in games, and not just aesthetic art, gets complicated fast, and that doesn't even begin to discuss anything else, from both motion capture animation, which can't really just be used right after it's captured, they need to be tuned for specific needs, to hand-done animations, to procedural animations, to camera animations, to getting the inverse kinematics right for sloped or complex surfaces, to basic pathfinding AI, to collision, to writing, etc. There are a billion different things that need to be done if you want a game to look and feel as polished and true to our imaginations as Final Fantasy VII Remake does for many of us so far. Even just the balance between looking good and feeling good is important, as Rockstar Games can attest to for struggling with that. If we wanted this game done in a single part, compromise would have to appear somewhere else. And a lot of it would have to appear somewhere else. Again, there's a reason nearly every JRPG these days looks distinctly last-gen when it comes to scene direction, detail, animation, and general art, in spite of using modern tools, techniques, and effects. They don't necessarily look bad. They just don't look like Red Dead or God of War, and it's because they're compromising each section of the product just enough for the sake of the whole. And again, when you're putting this much detail into extremely diverse asset pools, you want those assets to be wrung for all they're worth. So presumably, they chose to expand the game at least partially so that they're not spending 8 months just designing Bone Village so that you can show up, grab the Lunar Harp, and then leave after 2 minutes. For a bit of comparative perspective, it can take big Microsoft studios like Turn 10 around a year just to make one track for a Forza game. And this is after they've laser scanned in the entire track automatically down to like a millimeter or something ridiculous like that. Even though you would think the bulk of the work is done for them, the track still takes a year to make. Now imagine doing that for an entirely fictitious world. Remember, all of this needs to be kept in mind when judging how and why things in the remake were changed from the original. It's understandable if you, personally, would have been fine with a much simpler game artistically, if that meant you got the whole thing in a single game, but that's not what they wanted to make, and it's important to respect that. Other than the texture issues, which have been well documented, I think the development team did a rather fantastic job in this regard. The game for me has run rock solid at 30 FPS, is I believe 1620p on the PS4 Pro, loads fairly swiftly. I've only had a single example of a notable glitch where Cloud fell under the ground during a boss. It never crashed, and at times the game can look absolutely gorgeous. While countless people were sure that the month delay meant the game was undoubtedly an unfinished mess, as if you could fix an unfinished mess of a game in a month, it turns out Square must have been telling the truth. They claimed that they wanted everyone without access to great internet speeds to be able to experience the same game as everyone else on day one. No day one patch required. And as of writing this, there has been no patch, day one or otherwise. I think that says a lot. The environment design from an aesthetic perspective is relatively great in Remake. There are points where the game is breathtaking to look at. There are other moments where it looks rather unfocused though, usually in areas primarily made up of scrap in the slums. I feel like places like Sector 5 and Sector 7 are missing some semblance of identity. Places like Wall Market and even the Sector 6 collapsed expressway have strong identities that use color, layout, and texture to separate their piles of rubble and shantytown houses from others. But the rest of the core map between the different slums is largely just made up of dull gray corridors and open spaces. I think simply adding a distinct color to the trash, my mind jumps to yellow hues for Sector 5 and slightly green for Sector 7, would do wonders for making them feel more distinct. And I also think Sector 7 should have been more open and round in shape, rather than a spiderweb of walkways. Though that could have been a hardware limitation, considering how far one could potentially see into the distance at that point. There were definitely pretty serious hardware limitations that they had to work around in other places, considering how often Cloud needs to sidle through tight spaces. While some of these are clearly just designed as tiny pacing break animations, others strongly imply hidden asset streaming, so it wouldn't surprise me if they needed to limit vistas to maintain performance, particularly when you recognize how low resolution some of the 2D background assets can be when the player can see massive areas ahead. Remake tends to work best in enclosed or linear spaces like dungeon areas, Shinra HQ, and the upper place sections. The strongest balance between open level design and asset detail seems to be struck here. Thankfully, particularly if you only selectively use the lock-on system, because it isn't always necessary, the combat rarely suffers because of the level design either. We'll discuss the combat itself in detail later, but the only issue that seems to come up deals with the camera. It was never anything I couldn't overcome by simply moving the viewpoint a bit, which is a massive improvement over the mess that was Final Fantasy XV's camera. Weapons don't bonk on the environment here like they do in Kingdom Hearts either, so cramped spaces don't really come at the cost of your ability to fight. So what about the storytelling, scene direction, and pacing? How does that compare to the original? Well, in most ways, I think it's either just as good as the original or improved. Pacing can suffer at points. If you choose to do all of the optional side quests, the game can grind to a bit of a halt at times, but it's also important to remember that these are optional, and despite what some outlets have argued, these are not necessary, nor are they ever present to the point of suffocation. 4 out of the 18 chapters have side quests to complete, and there are a total of 25 side quests in the game, if you don't include arena fights and the Chadley battle intel reports. The arena fights only consist of combat without much context, and the Chadley reports are purely passive goals, most of which you'll reach by just playing the game. Out of all of the rest of the actual side quests, only a handful provide rewards you could argue are necessary. One of the first side quests is the introduction to Chadley, meaning you'll get a discount on the auto-cure materia as a reward. Only one other side quest in that chapter offers something that isn't a consumable, being the Star Bangle, but you can buy these later on anyway. In Chapter 8, you'll get the Nail Bat for helping the kids with the Toad King, which is definitely valuable. 3 other quests either give you an armor or an accessory, but again, these can simply be bought later. Chapter 9 offers a weapon for Aerith and a bunch of consumables. And in Chapter 14, the player can obtain the Time Materia, which can later be found in Chapter 17. You also get the ability to fast travel for free, weapon manuscripts for Aerith, Barret, and Cloud to upgrade their weapons slightly further, and a weapon for Barret. That means out of all 25 quests, the most valuable rewards come from just 12 of them. And if we get rid of the rewards that aren't unique, that number drops down to just 4 quests. There are, of course, other rewards tangentially tied to these quests. You can get an early MP up materia or cleansing materia as a result of things like shop inventory changes from these quests. But once again, none of these are things you can't gain elsewhere. It is therefore dishonest to argue that these side quests are required for balanced progression, or to get the most out of the game. They really only damage the pacing if you don't enjoy them and yet you still force yourself through them. Some people are trying to act like half your playtime is going to be side quests where you kill rats, which is absurd. Again, we'll discuss the specific quality of those quests later. The other issue with pacing that's unique to Remake comes down to 2 specific story dungeons that the game adds, which feel like needless detours from the rest of the experience. Some people don't enjoy that places like the collapsed expressway or the sewers were expanded, but these are at least in line with the parts of the original game that came across as interesting but underutilized. Not to mention, again, these places need to be expanded to justify the way the combat is designed and the pacing of the overall different experience in this game. No, the 2 areas that I think didn't need to be required and should have instead been optional dungeons are the return to the sewers in Chapter 14 and Hojo's lab in Chapter 17. These are both direct detours from the main plot, and roadblocks that lead the story astray instead of progressing anything that's absolutely necessary. I personally enjoyed them in isolation and as dungeons, but making them mandatory wasn't necessary. I think I'd have enjoyed them more if they were made optional, maybe even only accessible in hard mode. The game is still plenty long and fleshed out enough without them. In my experience getting people to play through the original Final Fantasy VII for the first time, generally it's about 35 to 45 hours to finish, 60 to 70 hours to 100% if you use a guide for the side content without using the modern port amenities like the turbo mode. Final Fantasy VII Remake took me about 39 hours to finish and exactly 80 hours and 1 minute to platinum. Both games waste some of your time here and there, obviously, and I don't think either is particularly worse about it, though the worst optional quest time waster between both of them is still definitely the full Fort Condor quest in the original, which requires players to return to an early area to do a minigame 12 different times. There's no way to fast travel there, the minigame can be expensive to finish if you don't know how to cheese it, meaning you have to grind a lot, and there are some points where you have to return, do the minigame, go back to where you were in the story, progress literally just a few minutes, and then return to do the minigame again. There's nothing approaching that tedium in Remake, though we'll see how Remake handles that actual quest in the future. My bet is that it's gonna be better. Scene direction, thankfully, is absolutely fantastic, some of the best in games of this ilk. Cinematography and direction is beautiful most of the time, and they really know how to make the most out of the characters. The dialogue is generally also an improvement over the original. Sure, at points it's a bit on the nose, and at others it's also kind of hammy, but this was also the case in the original. For people that already have an intimate knowledge of the original, I think it might feel a bit too in your face, but I don't think that really spoils moments for new players as many seem to feel. You have to keep in mind what exactly you're supposed to know at any given point, rather than what you actually do know. Sephiroth appearing this early is certainly different from the original, and while some moments like the death of President Shinra were certainly more effective in the original, I don't think building Sephiroth up this early is necessarily wrong either. I think it actually works to avoid the biggest problem with other stories that take place over the course of multiple games, which is that events can sometimes feel like a complete sidetrack because they need to find a way to justify transitioning to new villainous entities. Mass Effect is a great example of this, where the first game builds up to the reveal of an intimidating and dangerous enemy that threatens the entire galaxy. Mass Effect 2 then throws this to the side for the entire adventure, only to then tie it back into the original game's true villain reveal right at the end. While the writing in Mass Effect 2 is still fantastic on its own, it feels like too hard of a transition when we just learned that life in the galaxy is effectively on a timer. I didn't want to fight this new villain, I wanted to prepare for the true villain. Now imagine the same thing here. We spend the entirety of the first game building up Shinra as the main villainous entity, only to then suddenly pivot to Sephiroth at the very end, like in the original. And then the second part focuses largely on Sephiroth as the new villain, leaving Shinra as the secondary threat. This worked in the original because the Midgar section was shorter, and because the game was contiguous. It didn't stop at that point, because it didn't need to. But here, I think we really need more reason to care about chasing Sephiroth by the end of the first part, to justify it becoming the primary goal of the next game. Otherwise, it would likely come off as too abrupt. You can't expect people to spend an entire 40-hour game solely getting adjusted to hating a specific villain to then sidetrack them toward another. Even if that is the primary villain, it feels too abrupt. There's generally a mix of choices that work better for this remake and choices that struggle, but I think it skews positive overall. Part of this comes down to the emphasis on small things, which all add up to mean a lot to the experience. For example, I like that they use Cloud as the combat expert and distraction in the first reactor mission. He feels like he has a role to play in the team this time around, whereas in the original, it didn't feel like he was necessary for them to succeed at all, frankly. A lot of people were also worried about the fact that Shinra are the ones that ultimately blow up the first reactor. In Remake, President Shinra orders for this after Avalanche's bomb goes off. Many people thought the point of this from a writing perspective was to absolve Avalanche of sin, but in context there are actually a few layers to this choice. Firstly, it's clear part of the hope was that Avalanche wouldn't be able to escape the explosion in time. President Shinra could deal with him this way, blame them and look like the good guy in comparison, and then raise taxes for repairs. But beyond that, those taxes would actually be used to build Neo Midgar, doubling his incentives. While Jesse's intention with the bomb in Remake was indeed just to disable the reactor, not blow it sky high, Barrett still resolves that this was a positive outcome for the group, even though there's huge devastation all over the sector. He's clearly okay with reconciling that devastation with their goals to take down Shinra. As far as they know, they are responsible for the hurt that it caused. They are absolved of nothing. This strengthens the villains while making the fight between the factions look more cutthroat than before, and still leads to the same character ends. In the original, Shinra seemed to massively underestimate Avalanche, whereas in this, they're fighting much harder to use the group to their advantage, as well as take care of them. I'm also confused as to why so many people are complaining that Wedge still lives through the collapse of the plate. If you pay close attention to the original, you realize there's a huge logical leap in that it actually leaves his death up to question, but doesn't explain itself. Aerith in the original says she's going to get Wedge out of there and then focus on getting Marlene somewhere safe. Wedge is still alive when we leave him with her, and she seems to be performing medical attention or something. There's plenty of time for her to get him out of there, and yet after the plate falls, she seems to have left him there to die. He's right there, and she clearly had enough time to help him considering she helped Marlene. So what in the world happened? Did she literally just flake on him? Did he die from the fall a short while later? Did he tell her to focus on Marlene and leave him? Where is his body if he did die? Did she seriously leave it there? Whether you wanted Wedge to die in Remake or not, at least the new scenes made sense with the logic set up in the game, and don't paint Aerith as a heartless monster. That being said, I don't love the rest of the drama in the supposed deaths of Biggs and Jesse. It doesn't bother me that Biggs somehow survives. I just think the lack of drama in the original made their deaths more impactful. They didn't die heroic deaths with monologues and friends crying over their bodies. They died uneventfully in the background, which better represented the needless waste of life this war was creating. It better illustrated Barrett's brash leadership and bullheadedness as a problem he needs to rectify. He's just lucky it wasn't Marlene too, because thanks to his choices, Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse died for nothing. Not to mention, I liked the idea in the original that they could have survived if we had stopped the plate from falling. They all still seem to be alive. That driving possibility doesn't exist if they die before the plate falls. Or, well, seem to die before the plate falls anyway. One thing I do enjoy, though, is just how many choices they included in the remake that the player gets to make. Before release, based on the workload and the way some of the trailers were structured, I was positive most of the choices would be removed. Making 2 or more entirely divergent cutscenes based off of otherwise innocuous choices sounded like more trouble than it was worth, and yet they somehow did it. Granted, they're not all the same choices as in the original, but they're done well enough that I think it's really down to you which you like more. Both games include a hidden relationship system. In Remake, it affects the scene at Aerith's house where Cloud wakes up in the middle of the night. He'll either find Tifa, Barrett, or Aerith to talk to outside, depending on who you act the most favorably toward. And this system includes some moments from the original, like whether you make sure Tifa or Aerith is okay first when Corneo drops you into the sewer. Speaking of Corneo, he always seems to pick Cloud in this version, thanks to Cloud's sassy mouth. However, what Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith wear to the selection depends on a bunch of other choices you make along the way. Cloud's dress depends on how many quests he does in Chapter 9, for either Madam M or Sam in Wall Market, which itself depends on choices you made earlier in the chapter. Tifa and Aerith's dresses depend on other choices. Interestingly, the guiding factor for both of them is different, and some may not have noticed that it's heavily informed by their character and their relationship with Cloud. Tifa has an optional scene with Cloud after you've done the side quests in Chapter 3. In this scene, she says they should go out for a night on the town and asks him what she should wear, giving the player 3 choices. Whatever you choose here will change the dress she'll end up in. This aligns with the fact that she cares much more about Cloud's word than Cloud's character. She trusts him completely, even when she maybe shouldn't, because she can sense the caring person inside, and wants to stay close to him. Aerith has a similar choice in Chapter 9, but this actually doesn't affect her dress at all. Her dress is instead directly based on how many side quests you did in Chapter 8 to help the people of her home, Sector 5. She cares much less about what Cloud thinks and cares much more about how overtly kind and helpful he chooses to be. She wants to see him be that good guy. Both of these align incredibly well with them as characters, and I love that Aerith offers a faux choice to throw players off if they're not really thinking about who the character is and just trying to game the system to get alternative dresses they previously missed. The game includes a plethora of smaller choices that impact the experience in similar ways too. The bomb timer in the beginning changes what rewards Jessie gives you for helping with the mission. The leaf house will be decorated differently depending on your flower choices in Chapter 8. The choice between the elevator and the stairs in the Shinra HQ is still here, and is still hilarious either way you go through it. Though I am a bit disappointed that there's no item reward for taking the stairs. There are even a few choices that offer nothing more than alternative dialogue for the fun of it. While all of the choices from the original aren't present, the system is still fully intact, which excites me for future parts. They still had far more than an adequate amount of choices to make it feel similar but new. It channels the spirit of the original while still being fresh for returning players. That being said, I didn't absolutely love the wall market section. In isolation, a lot of the events are fun and entertaining, but as a whole, and despite their efforts, I think it struggles to show us what the wall market really is. While the dance section is certainly fun, it was a bit too much for me. I'm all for Cloud bending gender norms, getting in touch with the more traditionally feminine side of himself, and all of that, but the sudden change into a dance master kind of betrays the softening but still hardened, cold mercenary he's supposed to be. I just can't suspend my disbelief long enough to go along with him suddenly just being that fantastic of a dancer. I enjoyed it, but I don't think it was the best choice. Though it is funny that there's a line during the second reactor mission where Cloud straight up says that he doesn't dance, which feels like an intentional hint at the dance scene.
Times like these, you gotta save them.
Oh no, if you're about to ask me to dance, then don't.
Come on, don't be shy. How about you, Cloud?
I don't dance.
Overall, the whole of the wall market section is a bit too much for me. It lacks the dirty, dingy bite of the original, and instead adds a lot of flair and bright comedy that I don't think quite fits the world, and in particular Midgar. The original was comedic, but this section was not bright in how comedic it was. In Remake, Wall Market feels less like a seedy underbelly for sinners and more like a carnival. In the original, it was a pretty screwed up place. While funny too, the game still made it clear that many of the people in Wall Market were bad people doing bad things. In Remake, it seems more like the joke is that these people seem like they're doing bad things, but outside of Corneo, they really don't. Andrea doesn't run a brothel like you think, he runs an up-and-up burlesque house. Madame M doesn't run an adult massage parlor, she just massages hands. I still enjoyed it overall, but other than Genova's blood trail in Shinra HQ being turned into purple static goop, I think this definitely is the place where the teen rating affected things the most. And now it looks like it's time to discuss the elephant in the room. The thing that seems to have split people into two camps. Those excited to see what happens next, and those excited to see the supposed ensuing train wreck. Looks like we have to talk about the whispers and the ending, which also means it's time to talk about spoilers for the rest of the original Final Fantasy VII, and potential spoilers for the future installments of Remake. Again, if you don't want to know about any of this, skip to the timestamp on screen or in the description. Early on, the player will encounter a bunch of ghost-like entities while talking with Aerith for the first time. Neither the player nor the character is supposed to be sure what these things are, nor what their goal is. Initially, they seem hostile, but later on, there are points where they start helping the party. Along with this, there are a couple of spots where Cloud seems to be able to see glimpses of the future. At this point, I really wasn't fond of the fact that Cloud seemed to arbitrarily be able to see parts of Aerith's death. I also wasn't a big fan of the game directly pointing out that there was something related to Cloud that has to do with Aerith's first boyfriend, Zack. What made it interesting in the original is that it was a small, unassuming breadcrumb hidden in a conversation you think is more about how Cloud and Aerith are bonding. Clearly, something is up with Cloud, but there's no indication in the original that it has anything to do with her first boyfriend. That being said, the way it's done in Remake doesn't actually spoil anything for new players. Anyway, so eventually the team is informed by Red 13 that the Whispers guide the fate of everyone, so that the planet stays on course. They're directly related to the will of the planet. They do not help or hurt so much as they just try to ensure things happen as intended. This is where the game most drastically diverges from the original, and this is also where my thoughts on the conclusion of the game and future parts diverges from most people. A lot of people are jumping to very negative conclusions based on a few clues, and the way they've chosen to interpret those clues. Based on things that Sephiroth says, a few flashes of the future that we see, the direction of the scene with Zack, and the fact that the party ultimately defeats the Whispers and are free to decide their own fate, the general consensus seems to be that the future games will drastically diverge from the original. People seem to believe that Sephiroth knows he failed in another timeline, the timeline of the original game, and so he's focusing on trying to change that fate. In the process, Zack and Biggs seem to live where they originally died, implying that basically anything can happen from here forward. So let's go through the majority of the hints that might suggest this idea. Firstly, there are the flash forwards, which consist of Aerith's death scene and the ending of the original, where Red and his children look at Midgar 500 years after the events of the game. At the outset, this strongly seems to imply that these exact events are predestined by the Whispers, and so defeating fate means they're both up in the air. Will Aerith live? Will the entire ending of the game be different? Wedge initially lives through the collapse of the plate, which would diverge from the original timeline. So, as far as we can tell, he's later killed by the Whispers when trying to help in Shinra HQ. Biggs is also shockingly shown to be alive, directly after the Whispers are defeated, implying that changed his fate. The game largely shows a shot-for-shot recreation of the ending of Crisis Core, where Zack is intended to die. Instead, however, he sees the Whispers being destroyed over Midgar, and then we never see his actual death. What's more, there's a wrapper of some sort that gets caught by a gust of wind, which shows Shinra's propaganda character, Stamp, but here it's a completely different breed of dog from what we've seen elsewhere in the game. People also think that the Arbiters you fight represent Cloud and company from the original timeline, trying to protect their fates since they use the same type of weapons as your party. Others think these might represent Kadaj and company from Advent Children. Then finally, and most importantly, there's a scene between Cloud and Sephiroth, where Sephiroth seems to be aware of his fate and the fate of the planet and wants to alter it. On the surface, all of this makes for a compelling theory, and in a way does justify the idea that future games will be different from the original in spite of Katase saying this won't be the case. However, I think people are being quick to overinterpret clues based on what they believe they're seeing, rather than what they're actually seeing, what's being shown. Without even really thinking about it, they're kind of filling in the blanks. For example, did you notice that we don't actually see Midgar in the shot of Red and his kids, or Aerith's death in the glimpses of that scene? Did you notice that the original ending of Crisis Core sees Zack dying in a cloudy weather with heavy rain, and it only just starts raining here before the scene moves on? What if maybe the wrapper simply shows an old design for Stamp instead of one from an alternate timeline? There's a lot we don't see or don't have proper context for, and while yes, this could be for the sake of mystery for new players, it could just as easily be a red herring to get us as returning players to fill in those blanks. We assume that what we're seeing in those flash forwards is the exact scene where Red looks over Midgar or Aerith dies. We assume that the divergence in the scene with Zack must mean he lives, despite clinging so perfectly to the direction of the scene up to the point where he should die. We assume that Stamp must be from another timeline because it happens to fit naturally into the mindset we're already building. And we assume Sephiroth must be seeing the future of the original timeline in order to make his decisions going forward. Remember that at this point, the party doesn't know Cloud's connection to Zack, and in the original, they don't assume Zack is dead until they talk to his parents in Gongaga. Aerith clearly has suspicions that he might have died, but has chosen to live in blissful ignorance, continuing to assume he just dropped her for another girl instead. They were never going to spoil his death so early for new players, so they could just as easily be simply hinting at the connection he has with Cloud and Aerith in this scene. The way the scene is changed from Crisis Core also allows them to include the best of both worlds in terms of Zack's ending. By allowing Zack to fight off hundreds of Shinra soldiers like in Crisis Core because he's powerful enough to do so, but also allowing them to be true to the original version of the scene where he's pathetically shot in the back right at the last second. Notice also how Aerith almost seems to sense his presence in the rain, which she does also at the end of Crisis Core as he's dying, kind of like she can sense him returning to the planet. Alluding to that moment in a completely different context doesn't exactly make much sense if he's not dead here too and hasn't returned to the planet. Think about what the multiverse theory implies instead, because there are only really two options. The easiest option would be that Zack in Remake universe has been revived for some arbitrary, unexplainable reason, but that would also mean there are genuinely now two Buster Swords and wouldn't explain the alternate stamp design. Not to mention, that would prevent Cloud and everyone else from being in the position they're in, because if Zack lived, everything from that point forward changes. It would literally just have to be an arbitrary resurrection independent from time itself. If we go with option 2, the Zack we see live is instead alive in a third universe, with Zack clearly still dead in the original universe, not to mention the stamp thing not making any sense, since the implication is that it exactly follows the original game's story, and Zack dead in this universe in order to lead to the current climax of the first part of Remake, he would have to instead be revived somehow in a third universe, or a third universe would have been created by the party's choices. Why would any of that matter to the story being told here? Who knows? There's also a translation from one part of the recent Ultimania that talks about this scene, and brings up the two Buster Swords, how Zack can be there but also be dead, etc. But it doesn't actually give any answers, and could easily just be yet more allusions to the fact that the party and the player aren't supposed to know that he's dead yet. It strikes me more as clever, poetic prose aimed at building mystique, rather than saying anything definitive. What the developers have said is in huge contrast with this passage, and I feel should be taken much more seriously than this passage, particularly with how faithful a lot of the remake has been so far. Now, attempting to question this multiverse theory does nobody any good if I can't present a solution that makes at least as much sense. Luckily, I think I can. So first, as has been well established already, I agree with the fact that a lot of this is about meta-narrative shenanigans, and focuses on subverting expectations to make a statement. By and large, it seems clear that a lot of the choices here were made to craft a clear delineation between Remake and the original. The statement they're making isn't about massively changing the entire narrative to the point of it being a different game altogether, though. Rather, I think they're simply trying to let people know that this remake will never meet every arbitrary expectation every person has. It cannot be your perfect remake, and as such, you shouldn't expect that much. Instead, you should simply try to respect their own freedom as artists, and in return, they'll try their best to respect the artistry of the original, as the first part of Remake already did to a pretty stellar degree in many ways. I don't expect the whispers to show up in the rest of the remake much, because I think they've served their purpose in regards to the meta-narrative already. But beyond this, I think they're also trying to set up for an attempt to make the most shocking moment in the original game fresh once again. Aerith's death. How? Okay, so as I said earlier, I think instead of implying the characters are now living in a multiverse, I think the flash forwards are related to Sephiroth and the fact that he's absorbed the knowledge of the ancients from the planet. He can therefore sort of predict the future where he's lost, or maybe even a future where he's won and become a planet-devouring god. Interestingly, Aerith already seems to be suspicious of the fact that she might end up dying on this journey to save the planet. This would line up with the knowledge Sephiroth is siphoning from the ancients, since she can communicate with the planet and get the same information. Her willingness to defeat the Arbiter of Fate could speak to her lust to survive to see things through. Sephiroth, however, is also trying to use this to his advantage. He wants them to destroy Destiny so that he can change his own fate and potentially succeed. He's currently not strong enough to destroy Fate himself, nor while using his control over Genova's body. He knows he's supposed to fail thanks to the knowledge he gained from the planet. No alternate timelines necessary. As he begins to prove the powers he has to the party in later installments and makes their journey more arduous, he's going to try and distract them with more and more visions that eventually fully reveal Aerith's death and Holy being lost. He will show these things to them under the guise of it being a future they can't change. With her and Holy out of the way, he'll be free to summon Meteor, so manipulating them with these predictions would really mess with their heads. That would also explain why so many of the flashes focus on Aerith's death, showing the Holy Materia and Meteor specifically. Particularly if Aerith continues to push the party into the mindset that they can change things, this could really mess with Cloud's head in ways we haven't seen before, but still fit with the original narrative. Naturally, because of this, the party fully believes that they can stop this fate, having defeated Fate itself. They're free to stop Sephiroth from killing Aerith, and will do anything it takes to get it done. What Sephiroth isn't showing them though, or maybe he will just to mess with Cloud's head, is that Cloud's mental weakness and Sephiroth's control over his actions will force that fate upon them anyway. The party, and by proxy the player, will end up in the situation from the original game, and seemingly will be able to save Aerith, only to then fail at an unexpected moment, preferably and probably due to Cloud's lack of self-control. This would reinforce Cloud's weakness, Sephiroth's power and control over the situation, and make him seem infinitely more of a threat, and makes Aerith's death surprising again. Think about it. Even the majority of people who play games that haven't played Final Fantasy VII know that Aerith dies in the original. The impact of the moment in the original was largely predicated on the surprise of it. They actually permanently killed off a main character that you'd gotten to know and like. And they did it in a fancy cinematic cutscene. You have no choice to change it. But that surprise can't really exist today if it's played straight, because it's super common knowledge. So instead, what if they make it surprising again by making you think it's not going to happen? You can change fate, after all, right? I personally would actually love it if she died directly at the hands of Cloud this time. Have Cloud stab her, as the cutscene shows a wide shot that flashes back and forth between images of Cloud and images of Sephiroth doing the deed, making it clear that Sephiroth is the mastermind of it all, but Cloud is still ultimately at fault for letting Sephiroth get to him. I think that could make the scene as impactful and surprising as the original, while still more or less staying faithful. No multiverse required. Some fans are quick to jump to conclusions because they think Nomura being director is justification to jump completely off the rails. But Sephiroth already shows Cloud lies in the original, so what's stopping him from showing Cloud a version of the ending cutscene with Red, where the party loses and Red is doomed to roam a rotting husk of a planet? It obviously isn't gonna say 500 years later, so they're not gonna know when that takes place. What's stopping him from showing Cloud flashes of Sephiroth winning in the final duel between the two of them? Heck, what if the original death scene for Aerith ultimately plays out the exact same, but instead Sephiroth simply shows Cloud images of himself doing the deed along the way, just to screw with him? When combined with Cloud's existing self-doubt after hitting Aerith and giving away the black materia, that could easily make him a bit unhinged, extremely scared and confused, which would only grow when he can't stop himself from raising his blade against Aerith. Sephiroth has told him he has to kill Aerith, and he can't stop himself from doing it. The point is, it's so easy to come up with variants of the original that stay faithful that I think it's kind of funny so many people have already settled on it being a mess of new ideas that Nomura must have come up with to betray the original. I dislike a lot of Nomura's outlandish and shallow, nonsensical ideas too, but that doesn't mean everything he touches turns into dream drop distance. Am I saying that I'm clearly right and everyone else is obviously wrong? Definitely not. My ideas are just as much a theory as everyone else's. However, given that Katase has stated that they want to stay faithful from here forward, and for the most part this remake has stayed faithful so far, well, I feel it's only fair to have a little faith in them. Even if it does end up being completely different, I'm fine just seeing where it goes. I'm 110% okay with continuing to play the original for the original story. We can argue the semantics of titles and remakes and whatever all day, but ultimately a name or a term doesn't change the quality of a product. The Nova isn't an awful car just because Nova in Spanish means doesn't go. I don't need this remake to serve as a substitute for the original. You don't really get the same experience watching Peter Jackson's King Kong or the modern Planet of the Apes movies as you do the versions that preceded them, but we wouldn't criticize these newer versions for not being a good replacement for the original. Instead, we can appreciate them as their own thing. It's also not like Final Fantasy VII in its original form is unapproachably stuck in its time. Plenty of people have played through it for the first time right before Remake released and fell in love. And what happens in 20 years when this version is out of date and VR has completely taken over? Should we really expect Final Fantasy VII Remake VR Edition Remix to be yet another replacement? Because that's not what I want this to be, and that's not what I want that game to be in 20 years. It's also clearly not what the developers want it to be. They have repeatedly said, this is not a replacement, this is a companion. You should play this and be excited to play the original, or vice versa. If this game does end up being massively different from the original, maybe in 4 years I'll be glad about that fact and excited that the story can feel fresh again. I'm already kind of excited that the story is feeling fresh. That's how I felt when I recently played New Threat with all of its retranslations too. It wasn't the same, but it was refreshing. If I'm honest, exploring Final Fantasy VII Remake as an original game is the thing that's far more important to me personally, though. It's also the thing that I was the most worried about. As I've made clear before, I am not one of those series fans that dislikes modern Square titles on principle, or thinks they're incompetently made. Many of the modern Square games have improved greatly over the classic titles in various ways, and they're always willing to take pretty serious artistic risks with each entry in the Final Fantasy series. I like that the most consistent thing about the Final Fantasy series is its emphasis on exploring the ideas of their artists and designers and pushing the JRPG in new directions. That being said, it doesn't always pan out particularly well. While it certainly has some good and even great elements, Final Fantasy XV isn't exactly the best game. The gameplay isn't the deepest, and while a multitude of improvements were offered post-release in free updates, the post-game fights in particular are a mess of spongy enemies that take little thought to conquer, and instead rely on item spam and button mashing. The world is pretty sterile and empty, the writing isn't the best, and many of the side quests that aren't about hunting monsters are pretty simple and repetitive. It's not a bad game, it's just not a great one. In fact, I'd argue it's the weakest mainline game in the series since Final Fantasy VIII. While Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't being made by the same team as 15 and isn't using the same engine, in my head I couldn't help but to worry about whether it would end up being as flaccid as 15 can be. Those fears were repeatedly put at ease to some extent as we saw more of the game, but then games like Kingdom Hearts 3 released and brought those fears right back. I honestly cared little about how faithful this remake was when compared to how much I simply hoped it was a well-told game with balanced, focused, and polished gameplay. Thankfully, I can more or less say that's exactly what we got. Most of the writing, dialogue, acting, graphical polish, and gameplay design in Final Fantasy VII Remake ranges from great to phenomenal. Other than maybe Kingdom Hearts 2, this is easily the best action combat system Square has ever had when it comes to realizing its intended goals, and this game somehow has some of the most down-to-earth storytelling outside of Final Fantasy X or 12. So let's explore Final Fantasy VII Remake simply as a game, not a remake for a bit. Action combat systems aren't exactly the easiest thing to get right. There are a multitude of general templates to start with that can get you to your goal, but in my experience, it's not exactly common for everything to come together in a way that transcends mediocrity. Final Fantasy VII Remake intends to create a visceral, fast, and kinetic experience, but also wants to marry that with the feeling of strategy from a turn-based system. That meant it effectively has two major points of failure, those being the action systems, how they feel, how they communicate information, and how they balance out, and then the turn-based systems, which also have to feel good in their own way, communicate information in their own way well to the player, and be balanced well, again, in their own way. As you delve into each of these two pillars, though, you realize those three core balance points of each require different expectations to be met. For example, for the action systems to be clear in their communication and feel good to use, they need to be responsive, have intentional and strong keyframe animations and hitboxes, and give the impression that they're a valuable part of your arsenal. Well, it definitely matters that your dodge roll dodges attacks consistently, takes you where you want it to take you, and isn't too powerful. It matters just as much that it doesn't feel sluggish and the wind-up and recovery frames read clearly. It's more about the attacks feeling like a satisfying effect of you pressing the corresponding button, not just it being balanced. Contrast this with the turn-based systems, which rely a lot more on clearly communicating the exact effect of an option through the description, and giving the player as much information as they need to make an intelligent decision. These are much more about satisfaction through strategic effect and spectacle than kinetic control response. They should generally feel distinctly special when compared to basic attacks, and should offer a slight change in rhythm to keep combat flow from stagnating. This means it's actually often preferable if these special attacks are slower and more deliberate rather than snappy like the normal combos. That's also why it's okay that poor timing of these attacks can cause them to miss. You have all the time in the world to line up a proper execution of Braver. It's your fault if you mess it up, so it's given less extreme homing properties than, say, the first attack of a normal operator mode combo, to reward properly thinking the attack through, rather than blindly mashing through your ATB menu. Final Fantasy VII Remake excels in this regard. There are very few action combat systems that I would put on the same level as this in terms of polish, focus, and refinement. The core combat is crisp, fast, varied, and the enemies complement it really well. But the ATB system adds another layer on top that forces players to slow down and think for a minute. You can't get enough ATB to win without utilizing the action combat, but you're going to have a terrible time with it if you try to rely solely on the action combat and don't give your ATB actions proper thought. They synergize really well. It's kind of funny that there are two major complaints that seem to be thrown around when it comes to this game's combat, and both can sometimes serve to make it transparent that certain people complaining didn't really give the combat much thought. Those complaints are related to the AI and character switching dynamics, and the length of time bosses supposedly tend to take to defeat. The length of time bosses take is a simple issue to disprove, because once you get a handle on the expectations the game places on the player, you realize that bosses only take a long time if you're not properly utilizing the mechanics at your disposal. What takes 15 minutes if you're flailing around, spamming abilities blindly, and or trying to do the bare minimum to succeed, takes 3 to 5 minutes if you're strategically prepared and playing intelligently. This game kind of feels like a pendulum of sorts, which swings heavily in your favor if your gameplay is on point, and swings heavily in favor of the enemy if you're playing sloppily. It's kind of like Devil May Cry, Dark Souls, or Monster Hunter World in that way. Go in unprepared and try to wing it, and you're gonna get wrecked. That's not to say bosses can't be improved in this regard. The best way I can see to do so? The aesthetic presentation of the boss's health. The only health bar for bosses that's always on screen is the tiny one above their head, but it's so small that hits often look like they're doing the tiniest amount of chip damage. It makes fights feel slower than they may actually be. So a simple solution is to keep all of the stat values and everything else the same and just put a big chunky Kingdom Hearts style health bar with multiple sub health bars in the corner. I think people would be singing a completely different tune if that aesthetic change was made, because every hit would feel like it's making more of an impact on the boss, even if it really isn't. The point is, paying attention and experimenting pays dividends in Remake. Some of this stuff is obvious, like Tifa's basic attacks generally doing more to build the stagger gauge than most other basic attacks from other characters. Other things include the fact that Barret can charge his overcharge meter significantly faster if you press the button right after he's finished a normal combo. Doing this loops the charge animation into his reload cooldown animation. Or there's also the fact that Cloud can block and counter attacks with a well-timed switch between Operator and Punisher. Elemental Materia on your weapon doesn't just boost attack damage, but also makes it easier to build stagger gauge. On top of that, it makes it far easier to get enemies into a pressured state in the first place, since you're combining elemental weakness attacks with attacks that do more damage, both of which seem to contribute their own boost to your ability to pressure enemies. Likewise, if you have elemental leveled up enough to negate or absorb damage when placed on your armor, attacks of that element will no longer even stagger that character, allowing you more time to stay on the offensive. I also see a lot of people avoiding the block button, instead entirely relying on dodges. And that's fine, but block genuinely has some fantastic use. Some attacks are just too difficult to easily dodge, or even largely undodgeable. In these cases, it's obviously better to block than to attempt to dodge, but blocking also cuts down on damage far better than many players seem to realize. In the post-game, for example, there are some enemy attacks that can do upwards of 4,000 to 6,000 damage, but if you block, you can bring that number down as low as 800 damage, and you'll be able to recover from that damage faster and go back on the offensive. Again, learning the flexibility of your options makes a huge difference, so if the bosses are taking you longer than just a few minutes, you're probably doing something inefficiently. Not everything about the core combat is perfect though. Air combat is really weak, though to be fair, I'm not sure how to solve this issue. Make air combat too effective with melee characters, and ranged characters lose one of their major contributing uses. As it is, it's frustrating, but I also think it's favorable to characters like Barret and Aerith becoming nothing more than backup for emergencies. Some people don't love the fact that you can miss with abilities and limit breaks, and while I definitely think it's an issue that mid-battle cutscenes can eat these attacks, I otherwise think it's smart that you have to position and time these attacks well. It forces players to think a bit more when they use them, similar to limits in Kingdom Hearts 2, Devil Trigger in DMC, or a super in a fighting game, though it would definitely be nice if characters took reduced damage while using a limit. Summons are also arguably implemented better here than in any previous title. The only one that really competes is Final Fantasy XII after the Zodiac/International editions. In the majority of the games, summons are usually extremely underpowered for their cost in MP, but they're also really shallow strategically. They're either useless if you don't want to spare the MP, or they're just a generic free bit of damage attached to a fancy cutscene if you can afford to waste so much MP. This means that these godlike beings that, in terms of lore, could crush almost anything in their wake, feel kinda like a joke. In some of the other games though, the cost is so low that they become overpowered. In Final Fantasy VIII and X, it's a bit too easy to rely on summons entirely, which builds bad habits in players that come back to bite them as soon as a challenging fight actually comes around. It's also not particularly engaging to rely on them all the time anyway. In something like Final Fantasy XV, the summons only show up in select circumstances, because they absolutely lay waste to almost anything you can fight free of charge. This makes them truly feel like gods, but it also trivializes their use, meaning player choice is greatly limited. Final Fantasy VII Remake finally strikes a good balance. Summons still feel slightly random, as with Final Fantasy XV, but they can be used far more frequently. They're extremely powerful, but not so powerful that you can just spam their attacks and dominate. When one is out, you have to direct it properly, and instead of a one-time MP cost, they cost ATB, which can mean spending potential damage, pressure, or even healing opportunities on them. These summons feel like gods, but they also feel balanced, largely thanks to the fact that different summons have different sizes. You're not going to get Leviathan in a small but challenging side quest fight. Instead, you'll be able to summon something like Chocomog or Cactuar. It's actually extremely clever to do it this way, because it melds the godhood of these creatures with the balance of the game in a way that feels, well, balanced, but also lore-friendly. Summons can be used extremely frequently without feeling abusable. I will never understand why people just want them to be use MP, big damaging attack. What is interesting or engaging or fun about that? We already get the big damaging attack at the end, so why can't we actually strategize about whether it's even worth using them or not, and whether it's worth using ATB for special attacks from them? Materia is a system that I'm less positive about, though I don't want to give the impression that it's bad in any way. As I explored in my critique of the original game, the most important and integral aspect to the design of Materia was the systemic nature of its design. Thanks in particular to the independent and support Materia, the system was built like an incredibly flexible set of functions, which could build off of each other without much in the way of limitations. The developers simply set up a Materia to cause a specific effect when certain criteria were met, and the Materia acted accordingly. This makes use of the system cavernously deep, because the relationships between Materia could go much further than previous or subsequent ability systems in the series. It's effectively like a snowball that gets exponentially bigger the more effort you put into it, until eventually it rolls down the hill all its own, crushing everything in front of it. Remake had a tough road ahead in regards to translating the systemic elements of Materia, and I can't really say it succeeded. There certainly are a few systemic pieces, and you can create some rather clever effects with them, like using Aerith's Arcane Ward in conjunction with a powerful spell, and then the Synergy Materia on another character. If they're both positioned in the ward, Aerith will cast the first spell, which will cause her to cast another spell basically for free. Then the character with Synergy will respond by casting the spell attached to that materia, and if they're in the ward, they too will cast it twice. It's effectively a make-your-own quadra magic. I also don't want to imply that they didn't think the system through. It's extremely clear that they put a ton of effort into translating as much of the mechanic as they could, but the action-oriented combat makes it far harder to craft similar domino effects purely because a lot of what was offered in the original game would end up interrupting combat constantly and taking too much control away from the player. For me, it says a lot for that as long as this game has been out already, I still haven't really been able to come up with a single solid systemic materia option that would support the existing combat design. One way they changed the system to better suit this game and better balance things, though, is by limiting how many of certain materia you can gain. This was done for a very select few materia in the original, but any materia that could level up could be duplicated when they reached max level. Other materia that were extremely powerful could simply be bought in mass. One of those materia was the All Materia, which magnified the effect of an attached spell so that it hit all enemies or party members. In Remake, the equivalent materia, aptly named Magnify, can only be obtained once per file. Even subsequent New Game Plus playthroughs won't allow you to obtain more. This may initially sound awful to anyone who's played the original game, because the All Materia was integral to that system, and probably the most commonly used materia ever. But it also was far too powerful, largely due to its ubiquity. I can definitely see an argument in favor of allowing players to gain more Magnify materia, because the game already limits weapons to a maximum of just 6 materia slots instead of the 8 that were in the original. Not to mention, I couldn't find a single armor piece in all 80 hours of my playtime that gave you more than 4 materia slots. This means players would be spending a significantly higher percentage of their materia slots on Magnify combinations if they wanted to stack everyone with just a few magnified spells. At the same time though, just putting Revive and Healing Magnify combinations on each character would easily break the game. I think forcing players to pick a dedicated healer and then reinforce that role for that character greatly improves balance, which, as my previous video also illustrated, was an absolute train wreck in the original game. MP pools are also significantly smaller in Remake, and it's not as easy to fill them back up either. This helps push players further to think through their use of magic, and really make the best use of it. And if a character isn't going to be heavily magic focused, there's a plethora of materia that doubles down on action combat, ATB use, and other types of support roles. It's a solid system for sure. I just personally wish it was as deep as the original. Maybe we'll see that going forward. These smaller MP pools have a huge effect on the included hard mode that's designed for New Game Plus playthroughs too. Hard mode is genuinely a great inclusion, making enemies a lot tougher, giving bosses new attack patterns, and not allowing the player to use items or rest to refill their MP. Resting only refills HP, and MP only refills at the start of each chapter, and without the use of items at all, you either have to rely on accessories or spells to deal with things like status ailments. It further pressures players into playing smart, because throwing everything at an early chapter boss or frivolously healing could lead to you being completely unprepared for subsequent fights in that chapter. You can't really make your characters jacks of all trades and masters of everything anymore, though you don't have to specialize them either. As you might remember, when I started discussion of the gameplay balancing, I mentioned that there were actually 2 major issues people took with the gameplay design, one of which I still haven't discussed. That other issue is, again, how the AI and party system functions. A lot of people seem to have a problem with how much the party AI seems to hang back when you're not controlling a given character, and I do have a few small issues with this as well, but I think the people who are complaining a ton don't really understand the point of the system, and arguably the combat system as a whole. To go on a bit of a tiny rant for a second, I find it hilarious that swaths of people complained that you couldn't use every character in Final Fantasy XIII and initially couldn't in Final Fantasy XV. But now they're complaining that Final Fantasy VII Remake basically expects you to be switching characters regularly to do well. I can totally see the complaints with Final Fantasy XIII and XV, because though I think these choices were made intentionally, I don't think they were particularly well justified. That's why this was changed in 13.2 Lightning Returns and 15's patches. Final Fantasy VII Remake, by contrast, heavily emphasizes using everyone in your party from the start, not just on a basic level by including enemies that are out of reach for melee characters, or enemies that can be pressured easier with Aerith's magic-based standard attacks. It also doesn't just give you a party and then let you get away with switching characters at your convenience. In fact, the integration of the AI and party system goes far beyond this, and that's kind of what brings the game together and makes its combat so special. This is kind of the job system combined with the materia system and brought into a current game. As mentioned briefly earlier, enemies tend to prioritize targeting the character you're currently controlling. This allows you to spread damage out, avoid having AoE attacks hit more than one character, evade attacks by timing character switches at the right time, get more ATB gauges for characters more often, keep certain characters out of the line of fire so that they can target weak spots without fear of much retaliation, etc. The AI party members largely just block attacks and try to keep themselves safe when you're not using them. That means if you're away from them for too long, you can generally rest assured that they'll at least keep themselves healthy. But they also won't gain much ATB, meaning they're not being particularly useful either. Though this can be combined with the steadfast block materia, so that if they do get hit while blocking, they'll get a boost to their ATB gauge. You're free to switch to them whenever you want, and you can choose who you want to switch to, but you're heavily encouraged to fully utilize everyone, rather than just specializing in Tifa or whatever. The AI won't ever use ATB bars by themselves, meaning they won't randomly waste a chance to use an ability that could have turned the tide of a battle. I can see how many people might find this annoying, because it feels like you're supposed to do all of the work yourself. But, you are supposed to do all of the work yourself. I thought everyone hated that the AI could make large decisions on their own in 13 and 15, but now that's what we prefer, I guess? I've seen people propose using a Gambit-style system, but for the first time I can think of, I don't think that would be a great fit for AI companions. Again, the point is that you're supposed to be regularly switching between each character and taking full advantage of them, like switching styles in a DMC game. Gambits would override that, because you could just set those characters on autopilot and stick to one character. You really have to think of the other characters like different attack styles rather than dedicated party members. They're not supposed to be competent at anything other than staying alive, because if they were, the player would have significantly less reason to keep swapping back and forth on a regular basis. The game would have to be balanced to be tougher to take that into account, and the balance between action combat and ability usage would be skewed way too far in the direction of abilities, because they'd constantly be getting free ATB gauges for you to spam. About the only real problem with the system, and it's something I myself am confused by, is the fact that when your allies do attack enemies, they seem to gain significantly less ATB gauge than they would if you were manually inputting those same commands. I don't see the purpose of this, considering they attack infrequently enough that I don't think giving them normal ATB growth would break anything. This is also why a decent amount of damage in Remake is largely unavoidable. I've seen a lot of people complain about this too, but surprisingly it works here, because unblockable damage is generally high enough to whittle you down over time, but not enough to feel unfair or steamroll you, not even close. As I said earlier, part of the idea is that if you can't dodge the damage, you should be blocking instead, or even better, switch between characters regularly enough that they take damage evenly. Switch at the right time, and the character you were just playing as will block the attack. Then the enemy will target a new leader, spreading the damage out and giving you more time to keep on the offensive. Keeping on the offensive means more ATB, which means more chances to deal more damage, stagger, heal, etc. All of this comes together as an attempt to push the player to play as every character and use your party to its fullest. The overall point is, the combat in 7 Remake is incredibly polished, competent, and well designed. It stands with a select few other action games as some of the best there is, and honestly, if this game gets any updates beyond just fixes for minor glitches and the texture issues, I sincerely hope it's more post-game fights. I just can't get enough. That doesn't mean the game is perfect in other areas, unfortunately, so let's clean up the rest of the game with discussion of everything new that surrounds the combat. Firstly, we have the side quests and general mission design. Story missions are usually pretty great. While mini missions may be on the longer side, they're usually full to the brim with reasons to explore, secrets, cutscenes, and unique combat encounters, and often include several different types of environments to keep the aesthetics fresh along the way. Yes, while there are 2 treks down into the sewers in Remake, both are pretty drastically different in terms of visual design and layout. But there are still some flat spots. With the initial sewer section and the train graveyard being expanded, I think they needed something in between to break these 2 dungeons up just a bit. And even though the gimmick in Hojo's lab isn't a terrible one, there isn't much variety to it, meaning the section can drag just a bit. Though again, that's also largely due to the fact that it's a detour in the middle of the climax of the game. It's more so the lust to get back to the story that makes it feel long-winded. Make it optional, and like I said, I very much think that would change. It's really the side quests that are more contentious. On the one hand, the people who argue that these side quests are lame, pointless filler that add nothing are grossly overselling the worth of these side quests, both for the reasons outlined way back at the beginning and more. Most of the side quests have something to do with exploring Midgar and its denizens to expand on the world. While the things they have you doing are often pedestrian, they're also usually extremely quick, easy, and give you just a bit more context for the people in the world and their daily lives. That's something that places like Sector 7 desperately needed, considering it's difficult to feel too bad for it being crushed in the original when you genuinely spend just a few minutes there. What's more, I hate that so many people are taking 2 specific side quests out of context to paint broad strokes about the game and make things look worse than they are. These quests are 2 of the very first quests you get. One for helping a little girl named Betty find her cats, and one for killing a couple rats for a shopkeeper. Sound familiar? They should, because these quests are both super common tropes within RPGs. They were regularly used as early side quests in many RPGs way in the past. Later games started subverting your expectations with them or even making jokes out of them. That's exactly what Final Fantasy VII Remake is doing too. You can't honestly tell me you seriously think they didn't know about that joke, right? The intention here was threefold. Use these standard quests as very basic tasks to get players to explore and memorize the basic layout of Sector 7, use them as easy-to-understand ways to tutorialize how side quests work, and to make fun of the trope while also laughing pretty heartily at Big Tough Mercenary Cloud for being relegated to what effectively amounts to being a maid. The joke is that Cloud thinks he's beyond this kind of work, and that makes him pout with how dumb it is that he has to do it anyway. It highlights the fact that he feels he deserves respect for being an ex-soldier, without even earning it. These people don't give a shit about that, so that doesn't work for him here. That's important for where his character goes in the future, as is the expanded time these quests give him with Tifa. Why else do you think they called the rats Doom Rats? Not to sound badass, but to have you laughing at the idea that stupid basic level RPG rats could actually be a threat. And what do you know, to put the cherry on top of the cake and at least make it somewhat interesting to play the quest, they actually are a threat, so the fight is still enjoyable. Now that's not to say the side quests are all fantastic. The Chadley ones are fine because they're relegated to passive checklists that earn you rewards as you play, fights with summons that earn those summons, and post-game he offers more arena fights. The rest of them range from surprisingly fun and polished minigames to uninspired but enjoyable hunts, or in the case of Wall Market, a few rather great fetch quests, and then some pretty lame basic quests that can be pretty boring and tedious. I'd say most of them are fine though, but there are some that are definitely not easy to enjoy. That being said, I don't think that the problem is necessarily the quests, so much as the way they're presented. Imagine for a moment if instead these quests were only put into a completion journal after you completed them. Or what if there wasn't a journal for quests at all? Imagine if it did things like the original Final Fantasy VII and simply had people that wanted or needed things done out in the world. I think players would have been a lot more appreciative of what these quests offer if they weren't displayed like a list of chores. Keeping quests organic and hidden is how most of the games in the series have done it, and despite often having the same quality or worse quality quests in these games, people don't seem to mind near as much. The aesthetic changes almost everything. There are a few other things worth noting about gameplay really quickly. One is that I wasn't really bothered by the fact that Red wasn't playable. Honestly, it makes sense, considering how late he shows up. He'd be incredibly limited in use, so I think it's better that they simply save him for the subsequent parts. I'm really excited to see what they do with him based on how he acts as a guest party member here, and they kind of get a head start on his design because of that, as well as on refining his design based on the problems people had in the first part. The other thing is that, while hard mode overall is a pretty fantastic addition that I really enjoyed, one of the weaker aspects in regard to repeat playthroughs is how much of the game is slowed down with set-piece stuff. This, and the linear structure of the world, aren't too different from the original. The original was bogged down with battle transitions, screen transitions, tons of text boxes, etc. In Remake, you can skip major cutscenes with the press of 2 buttons, and there's no wasted time in between battles. You just defeat the enemies and go. But combined with the fact that you can't skip many set pieces, and can't skip the loading zone sections mentioned before, the game can be really heavily bogged down by wasted time that will add up if you're trying to rush through certain chapters on repeat playthroughs. I don't think it will bother me too much for full playthroughs in the future, but for getting the platinum, it was torture. Presentation-wise, a lot of the new stuff is really cool to see though. I'd personally never thought about the idea that a Shinra grunt might remember Cloud, but there's one that seems to do just that early on, and also near the end. It's a nice touch. Roche is also a great idea that makes a lot of sense. Why wouldn't other soldiers be sent to take care of our little bit of Avalanche? Roche is the solution to that little plot hole in the original, and I like that his characterization matches the realities of becoming a soldier. Soldiers are fated to live shorter lives due to cell degradation caused by their Mako infusion, so I can totally see a super soldier who can do things a normal human could only dream of, who is guaranteed to have a fairly short lifespan, kind of being a bit of a nutcase thrill seeker. He makes a lot of sense and was fun enough to watch. I just think it's kind of strange that he didn't show up again past his boss fight. I hope we see him in later parts because he was massively underutilized. Something I'm not a huge fan of is that practically everyone in Sector 7 wants in Tifa's pants. The game also makes quite a few jokes about Wedge being the chubby guy who just wants to eat, but I don't really see the point of being so blatant, let alone leaning so heavily into these tropes in the first place. I thought Tifa was supposed to be more than just a pair of breasts in a revealing outfit, and Wedge deserves more than just to be comic relief, and to be fair, they are more than that. I just think these bits calling back to those tropes were unnecessary, counterproductive, and for me, kind of annoying. Probably my favorite improvement to a character is with how they handled Marlene. She's the most adorable character to have ever existed in a game, and I will die on this hill. In particular, I just couldn't handle the scene where she's found hiding under the bar alone while everyone else is fighting to keep the plate from falling. She's too young to understand anything other than that her daddy is nowhere to be found, nobody else seems concerned with helping her, and scary sounds of panic outside make her feel like her only home might be taken away from her at any second. Nope, can't handle it. The music is also fantastic too. The remixes and new tracks are all top-notch, and have much more of a presence than you'd expect from a modern game. I like the variety, and am really impressed with just how dynamic the tracks can be. There's also a lot of influence from the rest of the series here. Many tracks sound like they belong in the 13 trilogy, Final Fantasy VIII, or Final Fantasy X in particular. My two favorite tracks are Midnight Rendezvous, and the collapsed expressway field music. Unfortunately, and lastly, the lip sync can be pretty awful at times, though this is mostly only a problem in the minor cutscenes with minimal animation. It's easy to look past, and can actually be fixed if they patch it, since the game uses live procedural animation systems to create these animations on the fly, so simply tweaking this system under the hood could improve things, though I wouldn't bet on that happening. Overall, I'm more excited for future installments of Final Fantasy VII Remake than I ever thought I'd be, because this one was better than I ever thought possible. When the reviews started coming out and it was getting 9s and 10s from a lot of publications, I couldn't believe it. I straight up refused to believe that it was that good. And while I personally still wouldn't even say it's quite that good, it got amazingly close. I'm pretty optimistic when it comes to Modern Square, and even I was surprised at how solid this game is. While it's not perfect, nor exactly what I wanted, which, again, it was never going to be exactly what anyone wanted, and believing otherwise is unfair and naive, it's still a fantastic start to this project, and I will gladly continue to support it from here forward. Here's to hoping that the quality keeps going in the future, and the artists involved shoot for the stars. But what do you guys think? Have you played Final Fantasy VII Remake yet? How do you feel it compares to the original? What about as a game on its own? What is your favorite part? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.